So you might have three kinds of people, right? You've got the hedonist who lives or dies by the random chance. If there's a banquet, they're happy. If there's not, they're suffering. There's the ascetic who shrinks from the world, seeks robustness, says, I will never eat or drink the wine because I will be sad when the wine is gone. And then there's the Stoic who is not sad if the wine's gone because they don't need it, but if they find themselves at a banquet, don't mind if I do.
Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros,
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
and today we're going to be talking about the book Antifragile by Nassim Taleb. Do you want to kick us off, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, this was a fun one to talk about. This is both one that Caleb, you and I have both read before. And I would say, I mean, I'll just open with this. I would say it's like kind of a life-changingly positive read. I think this is one of those books that I left with multiple paradigm shifting ideas and really changed the way that I think about the world. And I think I've never really had that experience with many popular nonfiction works. I've had that experience with philosophy. It's part of the reason why I love philosophy. But I would say philosophy is usually a lot of hard work, and maybe a bit more, I don't know, abstract or esoteric. Certainly, one of the things we like about Stoicism is that it's applied, but it can be that way. Um, but this was not the case. This was not the case with this book. I found it. Yeah, it had a huge impact on the way that I think about things. A couple of the concepts I'm sure we'll be talking about today, antifragility, but other things on top of that are things that influence the way that I live my life, the way that I really structure my day to day. Yeah, just excited to talk about it with you because I think it's a great book. For those that don't know, Nassim's, I would say, is definitely a character. He's a retired distinguished professor at NYU, a practitioner of mathematical finance, a former hedge fund manager, and I would say a generally grumpy reply guy on Twitter. If you've ever seen him on Twitter, he will say mean things to people and be very snarky and very quick to block. Quite a force of personality and will on there. Um, but I would say, I mean, to summarize his thought, and Caleb, maybe you have a take on this. I would say somebody that's really good at identifying. We talk a lot about stoicism, about being disciplined thinking, about how changing the way you think changes the way you live. Someone who's really good at identifying mistakes in the way people think, first in perhaps an economic or financial context, but then applying those or abstracting out those more generally to the way people live their lives or people's decision making processes, and identifying, well, look, people make these kinds of mistakes. That's why they fail in the market. Um, if you can avoid those kinds of mistakes, or recognize them, and you recognize humans' inevitability to make those kinds of mistakes, you can change your behavior accordingly, and then just do better in whatever sphere you're looking at, whether that's investing or any sort of goal or pursuit. I first read the book in 2017, had a really profound impact on me, as I said, probably my most influential nonfiction read, other than, keeping that category separate from philosophy. And yeah, looking forward to digging into it with you.
Yeah, I love this book. I probably read it around 2015, and it was the book that sort of reintroduced me to Stoicism, I suppose, is one way to put it. I had read some of the Stoics beforehand, read a little bit of Epictetus, some Marcus Aurelius, and for whatever reason, they hadn't stuck out to me. But Nassim Taleb
Huh.
does talk about the Stoics in this book and shows what's practical about them, what's distinct, especially about Seneca. And that is this book was one of the main reasons I dove back into Stoicism while I was at grad school. So it's also a very influential book to me. And on one level, it's an entirely enjoyable, almost like an airport book read. But on another level, I think it is a very deep book, and there's so many good ideas that are worth toying with in different practical and political or theoretical contexts that there's so much to talk about it. And I'm excited to
Yeah.
dive into some of its key ideas, what's good, what we don't like about it, and what some of these other provocative remaining thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that was something I forgot to mention, Caleb. Well, again, so there's that question of why are we talking about this on, Stoicism podcast? And I think part of what we do is discuss, different ways of living, different ways of thinking, well, and performing well in whatever you set out for yourself, whatever task you choose. But there's a whole chapter on Stoicism in this book. There's like an explicit, and I really love somebody who's making a contemporary theory of life, a contemporary argument for how to live, and then brings in the Stoics and engages with the Stoics as peers. That's a real kind of, I know I really like that kind of content. This team does a great job of that here, as you mentioned, turns you back onto Stoicism. And so part of our discussion will be the discussion of the key ideas of the book, and then part of that will be also how it engages with Stoicism, how it represents Stoicism, or how Nassim argues the Stoics were, in some ways, the originators of some of the ideas he argues for here.
Right, right. Yep, yep. Yes. Let's dive into it.
Great. And we'll use we've got kind of a tried and true method here. We'll kick off with some things we like about the book, talk about some things that we think are bad or more questionable, and then some things that are just kind of interesting or provocative that are left over that we didn't get a chance to dig into. Um, cool. If I kick things off,
Let's do it.
sweet. So the first thing I want to take a swing at, and Caleb, interested in your take. I mean, this is really cool because besides Stoicism, I think this is something that you and I are both really into that we haven't talked much about before. So feel free to, I'm interested to see if you feel the same way or if you would interpret these ideas a little bit differently. So the first, I said it was a really influential book to me. And so what I think is good about it is that it has really great ideas that have changed the way that I've lived. And I've pulled out three of those. But I want to start with the first one, which is anti-fragility, or this concept of being anti-fragile, with the book is named after. So, Nassim presents this idea that when we're introduced to the idea of fragility, you put something in a box, and then you introduce randomness. You shake the box, and something that's fragile, when you take it out, it's been broken, or the piece of glass you put inside has shattered, or in some way it's gotten worse. That's something that's fragile. If you shake the box, it gets worse. And we often think of the opposite of fragility as robustness. I shake the box and nothing happens. But actually, the opposite of fragility is anti-fragility, which would be if I shook the box and I pulled out my glass vase or something like this, it's actually stronger. It's actually a better vase than it was before. That's what it means to be anti-fragile. So part one is just introducing this idea of, well, look, what we want to cultivate is not actually being insulating ourselves for protecting ourselves from randomness, from chance, from harm. We want to cultivate anti-fragility, which is this idea to actually benefit from this chaos, randomness, harm, hardships, things like this. So it's and another key idea that we'll get into later that Nissim talks about is this idea of kind of unpredictability of certain events, and how robustness, I think, is a bit of a fool's game because you can only make yourself robust to things that you can anticipate. You think, well, it's going to flood here, so I can build up a wall. But then when a hurricane comes, it knocks down the wall, and you go, okay, well, I'm going to build something up that will prevent against floods and hurricanes, and then an earthquake happens, and so if you try to be robust, it's always kind of backwards looking, it's always kind of responsive, and then it always runs the risk of an unpredictable event actually breaking that robustness. But instead, I look at anti-fragility as almost kind of a virtue ethics. It's kind of an internal cultivation to develop a kind of a disposition to be forward-looking. So instead of being defensive, reactive, backwards looking, okay, well, if X happens again, I'm going to do Y. If it floods again, I'm going to do this. You develop the kind of disposition to be forward looking. So I'm the kind of person that can turn no matter what happens to my advantage. I'm the kind of person that can become stronger, better from these unpredictable events. Um, and so for me, that was a huge paradigm shift. That was just a wonderful idea.
Yeah, there's a nice glossary at the end of Anti-Fragile, at the end of the book, where he defines what he calls the fundamental asymmetry that in the abstract captures the idea well. And he goes as follows: when someone has more upside than downside in a certain situation, he is anti fragile and tends to gain from volatility, randomness, errors, uncertainty, stressors, time, um, which is a good abstract encapsulation of the idea. And I agree that, if you're thinking about, I want to become more resilient, there's that word is almost ambiguous. Does that mean that you want to withstand uh, stressors, randomness, what have you, or does it mean that you want to be able to thrive in the face of stress? And it's important to make that distinction, and that distinction can be action guiding in a useful way. I think about just general, just think about certain kinds of social conflict. If someone gets uh, canceled or strongly critiqued in a group, the fragile person is the person who loses their status, is completely removed from that group. The robust person is able to withstand it, and sometimes you see both in the public sphere and probably also in private examples as well, people who are able to come into conflict with others, and that they're able to emerge in a better position, either socially or perhaps even ethically from that conflict, and being able to be the kind of person who's anti-fragile in this way is often a good thing. I think one thing that's so good about this idea is that it's less of a focus on thinking about how do I withstand negative events, but it has this positive side to it. How do I not just limit my downside, but also capture any upside from these, from stressors, randomness, and so on, which I think is just much more, is an idea that has more energy to it than robustness, as it were, which I think is one reason why the style of thought caught on so much and became such a successful book.
Yeah, it's inspiring, right? It's motivating. You said energy. Yeah, there's something defensive about robustness, and I thought you put it really well with this idea of resilience. What does resilience mean? We talk about that a lot, and how do you define it? And it is ambiguous. It could be this kind of defensive, this kind of negative. It's like when things happen to me, it's as if nothing happened at all. Or it can be this exciting, energetic, empowering notion of, when things happen to me, great, what an opportunity, what a wonderful time to be alive. And there's something, yeah, really inspiring about that, as you put it, really motivating.
Hmm. Yeah, I think so.
So the second one, again, I had never been exposed to this before reading this book. The second idea that I took from this book was the idea of black swans. That's a name of a previous book by Nassim Taleb, which I haven't actually read, um, which I think focuses more on this concept, and then he pulls it into this one, which is the idea that unpredictable things happen. That's just it's just the kind of descriptive fact about the world, that the world is the kind of world where we will not be able to predict. We will never be able to predict with certainty what will happen. But there is this kind of meta condition, this meta fact that unpredictable things happen. And that's predictable. And we can be certain of that. So that the fact that black swans and those unpredictable things are the black swan, there um you would not expect there to be a swan that is black, but then you're confronted with that fact. You didn't predict it. And now what do you do with it? And so the fact that there will be black swans is something you can anticipate, but the nature of what will happen and how it will happen is obscured. And I think the important idea with black swans is it's not the idea of like, I will not know when it will happen. So it's not like, oh, there will be a stock market crash. I'm not sure when it will happen. It's this idea of something that kind of actually breaks the mold or the paradigm. And so I tried to write down some examples as like terrorist attacks, stock market crashes, or the invention of a new technology, or the asteroid hitting the Earth. And I think there can be some ambiguity because there's ways like, well, insofar as you can anticipate it, you can develop robustness to it. But the black swan is the thing that you cannot develop robustness to because you can't anticipate it. So I don't even know if those how well those examples work. And so my interpretation of the book was that the best way to deal with black swans and cultivate anti-fragility is to adopt a kind of Socratic humility, to recognize that you don't know everything, or to, in other words, to know what you don't know. Um, and so those that attempt to over prepare or over control or construct what they think they know will happen, they're caught most vulnerable because instead of, I don't know, maybe distributing their resources or their time and attention to the unpredictable, they say, well, I'm going to focus my energy on being robust. I'm trying to think of a metaphor, but if you put a shield in front of yourself because you think the blow is going to come from the front, and then it comes from the side, and all your attention is focused towards, I'm going to be as robust as possible from this blow to the front, and then it comes to the side. Well, you're actually more affected by that blow than somebody who maybe says, well, I don't know where it's going to come from, or I'm going to prepare a little bit in the front because that's likely. It's not skepticism, but I'm aware of the fact that I might not know what's going to happen next. Um, and so that's a kind of, it's a Socratic humility is kind of maybe a fact about the world. We try to think of the right way to say this. We don't know what we don't know, and that kind of can sound like a platitude. It can sound like, oh, obviously, or it can sound like a necessary condition. The black swan is kind of this external reminder or manifestation of, look, it's not the fact that we don't know what we don't know. It's that we're vulnerable to these things that can happen. And so we want to adopt the Socratic humility to not just limit that vulnerability, but maybe put ourselves in the position to turn it to our advantage as well.
Yeah. I think one point he makes it in this book and one of his earlier books, Fooled by Randomness, which I think is excellent. He also has this book, as you say, Black Swan, which I personally didn't get as much out of that book as some of his other ones. Um, but I think one framing on this is that, as you were saying, what are black swans? Key examples people often give is the housing crisis in the late 2000s. But on one hand, you might say, was that really unpredictable? Even people like Taleb ended up profiting from it. And I think one of his insights here is that these events hijack our brains in a way. We have this sort of narrative approach to the world. We feel like we sort of almost predicted them. Some people find maybe predicted them retrospectively. It looks much more obvious. But there's like this general illusion that these kinds of events are predictable, and that we should realize that we live in a world that's governed by randomness, what the Stoics might say governed by fate and fortune. Yes, one part I do like about Seneca is he's always talking about fate on one hand and then fortune on the other, and I think that includes these ideas that not only are so many events not up to us, they're determined by fate, but they are a matter of fortune, which we might say today as random, unpredictable. If we're looking forward, and any sense of predictability is often an illusion. To me, the upshot of that, and something that I think is core to Taleb's project or way of thought, I guess, to his worldview, is that you might think, okay, there's so much uncertainty. What should we do with that fact? Let's try to make it predictable. Let's come up with models, frameworks for saying, there's this amount of probability of a huge crash over the next decade. That means we should allocate this amount of capital in these assets and so on. But making it's especially easy to, I think, to think about this in the financial context. But that's one approach. But Taleb thinks a better approach is instead of like going through these different scenarios, trying to quantify them, thinking about, how can you build a system that's anti-fragile, and doing this exercise of trying to assign values to different outcomes and so on, perhaps useful, but is ultimately an illusion. And in the personal case, I think this is why he advocates virtue ethics. You want to be the kind of person who will exemplify virtues in whatever circumstance you end up finding yourself in, instead of taking a more utilitarian approach where you think about, if I do this and there's this probability this will happen, if I do this and this has this chance of this outcome, and so on. Of course, that kind of thought can be useful, but often it's rigid and fragile to being, just having assumptions that are undercut and ruin the entire framework and the entire model. So that's how I see black swans playing a important role in his
Yeah.
thought.
Man, I like that idea. Those fragile utilitarians. They don't know what's coming. Um, but that idea, yeah, if you develop a model based on probability, you leave yourself vulnerable and fragile. If you instead virtue ethics, focus on yourself. Again, not this kind of skepticism. I mean, even the ancient skeptics, we have an episode on that. Even they, they didn't walk off cliffs and say a 50% chance I'm in the matrix and this can't kill me, and 50% chance that this is a real cliff edge. They even the skeptics made decisions based on probability. But there's this idea of, if you focus on virtue ethics, personal cultivation, you'll be in a better position to deal with randomness as it comes, rather than. And I think we didn't talk about that, but maybe there's a kind of an edge case where because you have a model of how to explain the world, and then this random event occurs, and then you try to shove it into the model, and you're probably in that case slower to adapt, right? Slower to adapt to the black swan, because you're trying to explain it explain it in a method that doesn't capture it, or trying to fit it into a model so you don't even notice it while it's happening. Whereas, hopefully this somebody who's working on their anti-fragility, their kind of virtue ethic position wouldn't have that kind of vulnerability.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Well, one other aspect I want to add to this is that another key idea he has is that often it's more important to pursue what he calls knowledge via negativa, instead of thinking about, what is the correct model that captures the way the world is. That would be positive knowledge. Instead, can you at least eliminate and ensure that you don't make disastrous mistakes? So that's why it has this via negativa. It's just a focus on ensuring that at least you're not representing the world uh, the way it's not, and making, say, exceptionally risky bets that ensure your ruin if you make enough of them. Um, so having this approach towards focusing on subtraction as opposed to always adding new things to your picture.
I mean, I love that. There's so many good, so many great nuggets of wisdom in this. I love that. That's something that I should work on doing a bit more in my own life. But like, you think about that in any domain, what should I eat? Well, I'm not an exercise scientist. I'm not well, you probably have a sense that, eating candy and burgers every day, if you ate a bit more salads, if you, drank a bit more water, if you kind of cut out some of the junk food, you'd probably be doing better. Or we talk a lot about contemplation of the sage, and I think there's something motivating about imagining, as a Stoic exercise, imagining the perfect person, what they would do. There's something motivating about that, but sometimes people can be like paralyzed too and say, "Oh, I'm not the perfect person. I don't know everything to do." Well, if you can just get through a complicated situation, not doing some of the worst things, or cutting out some of the worst behaviors, and maybe you don't know what your life is going to look like in 5 years, or what kind of person you want to become, but now you want to be a bit less angry. Now you want to be a bit more disciplined, a bit less
Mhm.
procrastinating, um, unable to follow through on your goals. And if you can kind of trim the bad away bit by bit, maybe you're going to need some direction to really focus in for that last 20%. That's really the trimming is 80% of it, right? So the via negativa is such an important idea, and such, I think, a way to cut through procrastination around improvement. You don't need to be able to write the book on the subject before you can get better at it, right?
What one nice example of this that I see sometimes in Silicon Valley is focus on like biohacking and trying to improve your productivity. I think sometimes you'll see people who are testing out taking different stimulants in order to be more productive, doing microdosing, what have you, and that's that sort of that positive approach. Whereas many of these people, I think, if they had better sleep habits or better, really basic diet habits, would likely get more of that gain. And I think that's something that's an easy case to pick on, maybe, but a general illusion or temptation is looking for that positive fix instead of thinking about what are some potential changes or interventions I can make that at least reduce mistakes I'm already making in this domain and
Yeah,
whatever
I love it.
problem it is. Cool,
Um,
cool. What else you got?
so quick summary: we've got anti-fragility, we've got black swans, we've got learning from via negativa. Another idea in this book is benefiting from asymmetry or the barbell principle. So really, I mean, you summarized it really well at the start, Caleb. Anti-fragility is about being the kind of person that benefits from chaos, from I don't know if chaos is a bit extreme, but from randomness, from time, from asymmetry. Um, so another way to benefit. So, well, how can I be that is the question. How can I become anti-fragile? Well, one way to do that and become the kind of person that benefits from randomness is to live an asymmetrical life, like an uneven barbell. One of those things that you squat or deadlift that has a lot of weight on one side and very little weight on the other. So instead of 50-50, it's a kind of 80-20, 90-10 life. And one of the I still remember this example or the kind of paradigm he provides, one part of life. So one way to do this, not the only way. One way to do this is to live a life where one part of life is stable, constant, is sheltered from chance. That's your 90%. And then another smaller part is responsive to chance, volatile, agile, able to respond to black swans positively and fluidly. So, for example, if you invest 90% of your money into something stable and 10% into something with huge potential upside, let's say, 1,000% return potential, like Bitcoin at the, back in the late 2000s. Um, or, you have a steady office job and then you dedicate your side time to writing a book that has a small chance of being successful, but a very large potential upside if it is. Um, and so this is this idea of I think it's very practical, very actionable because it's a framework that you can fit in many different kinds of lives into. But if we because a lot about stoicism is dealing with this anxiety that comes from feeling like you're not in control of things, feeling like life is out of control. And one of the tools of stoicism is the dichotomy of control, which is to say, look, recognize that there's some things that you have a lot of control over, and then there's some things that you don't. And so a lot of
Mhm.
stoicism is about like developing a positive relationship, I would say, with chance, with lacking control, with the randomness of the world and the kind of anxiety that brings. And this is another way to develop a positive relationship with it, which is to say, put yourself in a position where you can benefit from some of it. But if you put yourself in a position where your entire life is based around chance, you go all in, I don't know, on your DJing gig without any evidence that you have a talent in it and with a lot of people that depend on you for financial support, it's going to be an incredibly stressful life because you've gone all in on a random chance or, you put all your money into the lottery or the jackpot. You've gone all in on a chance, huge upside if you win, huge risk, huge, I don't know, anxiety that comes with that. And so how can I expose myself to the upsides of risk and chance and randomness so that I actually like it? I have a positive relationship with it while being pretty secure, pretty stable. And that's with adopting this barbell principle, which is something I try to do all the time, put myself in positions to benefit from randomness without feeling dependent upon randomness, without feeling vulnerable to it, I would say.
How does he define the barbell? I think it's yeah, I suppose it's that there's the idea of anti-fragile. That's putting you want to be anti-fragile. That's putting yourself in a position where you can benefit from stressors. And then one way to do that is to take a barbell strategy where you're safe. You have this sort of a dual strategy. you make exceptionally safe decisions on one hand, and then on another, you take some more speculative risks. So he says in employment for a writer, this would look like getting a stable sinecure payment and writing without the pressures of the market during the spare time. That would be the idea of you have a set and stable gig. Maybe you're supported. If you think about some of these ancient patron models, you're supported by a patron.
Get
That
yourself a
would be
patron,
ideal.
everybody. If you're
Yeah,
listening
yeah,
to
yeah.
this, get yourself a patron.
Um, while being able to take uh, more speculative bets on other projects. So that's I think that's one way to think about the barbell strategy. I think in a way this is I think Nassim Taleb does an excellent job describing the Stoic approach to indifference in a way that probably is better than a lot of academic commentators, which is that, especially if you, and I think you see this especially in Seneca and Seneca talking about wealth, where the approach to wealth is to see it as an indifferent, not something that's ultimately valuable. And as such, you want to ensure that you're the kind of person who can live well in poverty or riches, not make the moral mistakes that both might tempt you towards, but also, it has this practical approach. Stoicism is not, all things considered, uh, anti-wealth, especially in the Seneca example, such that I think this is a nice way for thinking about the Stoic approach to wealth and other indifference is to ensure that you're protected from downside mistakes about indifference, whether that's on the moral side, attaining wealth by ruining your character, or on, the practical side, having such an attachment to wealth that you're unable to survive the loss of it, or you are anxious about losing it. And then ultimately, I think those are both the same. Of course, ancients think about the practical and the moral in the same way, and I think Taleb probably does as well. So you're able to protect yourself from that downside, but also appreciate wealth when it comes by, or what, if not wealth, other kinds of pleasures, art, uh, whatever comes with the goods of social reputation, and so on.
Yeah. So the idea there is that, again, for that, how do we expose ourselves to the plus sides while diminishing the downsides? And so how do we have a kind of asymmetrical relationship with those indifferents? Um, and and how is that connecting back to the barbell?
Well, I think it's how's it connected to the barbell? I'm not sure if it is. I guess the barbell, that's that dual strategy. So you want to be safe and make safe decisions on one hand, and then just take maybe more speculative bets on another. Um, but I think it is related to at least the kind of thinking that generated the uh,
Yeah, yeah.
barbell strategy, which is this focus on
Okay.
ensuring you're protected from making exceptionally terrible mistakes, um, and but also able to benefit from the randomness of the world. And I think it's captured in
Uh,
the anecdote of treating life as a banquet, being able to enjoy the food when it comes by, but not suffering the kind of attachment or craving that could ruin either yourself or the experience.
yeah, so you might have three kinds of people, right? You've got the hedonist who lives or dies by the random chance. If there's a banquet, they're happy. If there's not, they're suffering. There's the ascetic who shrinks from the world, seeks robustness, says, I will never eat or drink the wine because I will be sad when the wine is gone. And then there's the Stoic who is not sad if the wine's gone because they don't need it, but if they find themselves in a banquet, don't mind if I do. And that's that third option, where you're exposed to the upsides but protected from the downsides. The barbell strategy is one way to do that, but Stoicism has a different kind of strategy or hits on the similar things about achieving that in life, which sounds really appealing to me. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the barbell comes up in so many different ways. And I think Taleb has a style of thought where he'll see a pattern and then apply it to different dimensions, different domains. So you can have a barbell approach in your career, in your life plan, maybe even in your personality, and perhaps also in your philosophy. And that's interesting to think about. What does an ethical system that takes a barbell approach look like? And something I've thought about before is I think it looks like, virtue ethics with strong absolute prohibitions against doing things that compromise your character, but put you in a position to improve the world, which, if, that's the way fortune turns out, which I think is an interesting framing. I'm not sure if I've ever been able to capture to my satisfaction, but I think it is an interesting framing to thinking about, how do you think about these ideas in the context of, being a good citizen, coming up with a life plan that is a good one.
Yeah. I think that's a project worth pursuing. I think it's a great framework. This framework of asymmetries, literally 90% of the weight's on one side, 10% of the weight on the other. So it's asymmetrical in that sense. That leads to an exposure to upside with a decrease in downside. But now there's the question of, yeah, you were expanding that to the moral game, or just like the moral life, as instead of just the investment life or something like this, right? Like instead of a portfolio of returns, it's like the life worth living. Yeah, I don't think I have an answer for it or something to add, but I think it's an interesting example of how you can apply that concept in different settings, as you said. So another core idea from Antifragile that's really influential to me is this idea of skin in the game. Um, and the way that I think of skin in the game is this idea of like, look, we want to think the right way about the world. And so we want to have a thought process that adapts when we adapts effectively, right? I mean, I can think of this in like an athlete analogy. You want to become an effective basketball player. So when you play basketball, you should get information that makes you a better basketball player. You should learn from your playing. And so what ensures that you learn from your playing? Well, it's by having skin in the game, which means having some exposure to downside. So we've been talking a lot about protecting from downside, but we want to actually have some exposure to downside or recognize when exposure to downside is actually beneficial. In this case, in adjusting our thinking or adjusting the way that we approach things. So, the easy example is like if you put a child in competitive basketball and you teach them that winning and losing matters, they're presumably going to improve their technique or care about their technique because if they don't do that, they have exposure to losing, they have exposure to letting their teammates down, they have exposure to the consequences of their actions and or their decisions or the decisions of those around them. And so they'll practice, but they'll study the game. They'll try to improve if they get committed to that. You can always be apathetic and say, "Well, I don't care if I win or lose." You can step outside of it. But if you have skin in the game, you're more likely to succeed. That's the idea of skin in the game. The flip side of this, or Nassim's important point as I took it, was that actually recognizing how many people don't have skin in the game and using that as a helpful heuristic to understand who you should and shouldn't take advice from. So, if somebody is giving you investment advice, check their portfolio. If they say, you really should invest in Bitcoin, say, well, show me how much of your portfolio is invested in Bitcoin or Apple or whatever they recommend. And if it's a lot, well, then they have skin in the game. That doesn't mean they're right. They can have skin in the game, be wrong. You can lose the basketball game and be very upset that you lost. but it is a helpful heuristic to know who you should be listening to generally. Um, the other, I would say, the third issue of skin in the game is that there's can be kinds of people that insulate themselves from skin in the game over their entire lives or over their entire careers. So, I mean, there certainly is a strain of this book that I would say is anti-academic or anti. I wouldn't say anti-intellectual because this seems certainly intellectual, but anti people that comment on things without having exposure to the consequences of their ideas being good or bad. And Nassim, I think, points out sometimes academia can fall into that trap. Um, and so, I mean, I try to think of another example, but somebody who has had no skin in the game for such a long period of time that they're not even noticing that that's occurring, where the skin they have in the game becomes the game of prestige, right? So I don't know, you're an academic who writes on city planning or writes on um, some sort of practical policy issue, your skin in the game becomes getting your publication, getting your next promotion, getting your prestige to increase. That's the kind of game that you care about, and the downside you're exposed to if you publish something that's not well liked by your community. You're not actually participating in the game of, well, are these ideas working at a city level? Are they working with the populations that this policy becomes implemented in? You know, like something like welfare policy, for example. The professor is not, you know, receiving welfare, right? So they might have they might make bad policy and not really care about that because they don't have exposure to the downside of doing that. Um, that's my run at it. But so again, to summarize, this idea that look, if you want to get better at something, you need to have skin in the game. And if you're trying to learn from other people, um, be cautious of and observe whether or not they have skin in the game. Not that it means that they're right, but it's kind of a general heuristic of who to take seriously or not when they're providing advice.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's connected to this. Another strain that's running through the book is uh, a focus on tinkering or allowing yourself to make trials and errors, because that if these errors should be enough to motivate you, push you in the right direction. You know, if you're learning a new skill, always useful to say if you're learning a language, make an error, have that fixed, and move on. Well, of course, avoiding errors that might be ruinous for you. You know, you don't want to put yourself in a spot where you might say be completely unmotivated to take on learn the language or something of that sort. But you do want to be able to tinker, explore, actually speaking the language, and so on, as opposed to maybe insulating yourself from doing that when that's your ultimate goal. But instead, you spend your time, on Duolingo doing quizzes, which is not the same thing as speaking a language or exposing yourself to, what it's actually like in any real sense. So yeah, there's that point on learning, which is great. And one other point to add to yours is that one thing I like about this book is that it's uh, so fractal. So you can think about anti fragility in a person, anti fragility in a social system, and so on. So there's a lot on entrepreneurship, which works well if people are able to have enough skin in the game to fail. You know, particular individuals are going to be fragile, even if the system as a whole can survive a given business failing, a given entrepreneur failing. And that's, skin in the game is sort of a systemic property in that sense. It has a selective force to it. Um, and that's what drives, in many cases, improvements, as opposed to some system that didn't allow people to fail, didn't have any kind of selection, so evolutionary in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think you did hit it on. I was focusing a lot on, don't listen to people if they don't have skin in the game. One of the things you were talking about was that idea of like, you got to get skin in the game. If you're learning to write, you want to be an entrepreneur, you want to learn a language, you've got to get into a state of having skin in the game as soon as possible. And so, that's the kind of fear of participation trophies, right? You're reducing the skin in the game out of competition. You're reducing the downside to competition, which is not going to teach kids who are participating in it the benefits of it, or the motivation not to lose. Um, and that it makes me think of that Epictetus line about, if you want to be a runner, run, if you want to be a carpenter, build. And part of that is like doing the craft, but part of it is putting it out into the world, getting skin in the game, receiving feedback for your mistakes that is not ruinous, but is instructive. And you want to get to that point as soon as possible. Where I think what
Yeah.
happens today is people ruminate, as you said, that they have an end goal of being a great writer, and they won't ever try to put their things out for publication. They won't let anybody read what they write. And so you end up in this point with having no skin in the game for so long that you delay your progress, even if your long-term goal is to be a great writer.
Right,
And
right.
so
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think I
absolutely.
think I think part of Stoicism too, trying to connect this to Stoicism wherever possible, because I do think they have a lot of connections. I think part of Stoicism is learning how to get maximum skin in the game with maximum resiliency to having that skin in the game. So, okay, I have the skin in the game. I'm going to go and play a competitive game of basketball, and I might lose, and I have that skin in the game, but I'm not going to quit because I think my life is over because I lost, or I'm going to let somebody read my short story, but I'm not going to be destroyed by what they've read, or I'm not going to not let them read it because I'm so afraid of criticism. Stoicism, reconceptualizing what happens when we fail, putting it in perspective, giving it the appropriate value judgment, I think helps us do this, right? Helps us overcome the hurdle for skin in the game, which is really just fear, right? Anxiety, fear about your own fragility, about your own vulnerability to what happens if you do fail.
Right, right. Yeah, that's well put. So we've got a we should touch on some things that we think are less than ideal about this book, and then I think move to some more provocative type questions, or do you think some
Cool.
interesting,
Yeah.
outstanding questions for us?
I'm gonna nitpick for my less than ideal. I'm gonna nitpick Nassim's treatment of stoicism. So he has a passage on stoicism, which I think is good. And I just want to say, like, I think it misses the mark, and I think he does a good job as a non-specialist. But I don't want to be like, oh, you have to only study stoicism to write about it, because that's silly. I think people should write about it, wrestle with it, engage with it. But I think he gets it wrong. Um, and so he talks about stoicism being about anti-fragility, not about robustness. And he thinks people get this confused, and I just want to add a clarification. I do think a lot of Stoicism is about anti-fragility. It's about cultivating the kind of obstacles of the way, becoming the kind of person that can respond properly to new situations, learn from them, grow from them. But I do think that Stoicism's ultimate goal is robustness, I should say, sorry. And you might disagree with that or think that that's the wrong final goal, but that's what the sage is. The sage is robust. The sage does not learn from things. The sage is secure, undisturbed, peaceful. That's what the perfect person is for stoicism. But the progressor is anti-fragile. The way to get there is by getting skin in the game, by focusing on learning from your mistakes, focusing on learning from hardship, adopting an anti-fragile perspective. So um, that was just a distinction that I thought was important to make. Um, Again, nitpicky, but this is a stoicism podcast.
How is the sage not anti-fragile?
I would say they're not anti-fragile because they don't have anything to improve on, right? They are perfect. They have knowledge, so they don't learn anything. They don't improve their emotions. They don't become a better person when randomness happens to them. They are already a 10 out of 10. So they are robust in that sense. They can't get worse. Or sorry, they're robust in that they can't get worse, but they're not anti-fragile because they can't get better.
Yeah, yeah. This might be one of the places where Taleb's not that precise about anti-fragile, and there probably is a way to make it work, where I would say the sage is anti-fragile because they are able to use indifference well without ever, making severe mistakes, without corrupting their character. And in a real sense, sages can benefit from particular or in some sense, sages can benefit. And then someone might come across and be like, well, sage really benefit in a fundamental ultimate sense. No, but who cares for, our purposes, sage can be richer, they can have a nicer meal and so on. Is that what ultimately matters? No,
Well,
of course not. That's why they're protected against the downside. But they're able to, be fragile because they put themselves in situations where they might learn new things, or they might, uh, there's a famous example of Thales making a bet on wine presses that ends up paying off the philosopher Thales, winning a bet and so on. Which is, is that a technical benefit in the Stoic sense? No, but in an ordinary sense, it seems good enough for anti-fragility.
well, I mean, I'm happy to. Again, this is a nitpick, but I'm happy to say that the Stoics anti-fragile in the world of indifference, because indifference can always be better or worse. You can always get more that you prefer and lose the ones that you prefer, and get the ones that you don't prefer. So they would be anti-fragile. They would not adopt practices that make them overly fragile, because often the things that come of being overly fragile are things that happen with us being anxious, trying to control, trying to predict. And because the sages treats them like proper indifference, they'd probably be pretty good at not making those kind of foolish mistakes that come from overvaluing indifference. But I think I'm happy to draw a line in the sand between indifference and character. Their character is robust. Whereas I think the progressor's character is anti-fragile. I think the progressor's character is one that is, or the good progressor. The poor progressor's character is just fragile, let's say. But the good progressor is the kind of person where they go to a party and they see people doing kind of bad things. I mean, parties like a hedonist example, but they see people being angry or violent, and they use that as an opportunity to exercise virtue, or they say, "Wow, I don't want to be like that." They use it as a lesson, and they benefit from this randomness, this volatility. Or they fail and they say, "Wow, it's a good reminder for me that I have a problem with my temper." So the progressor is morally anti-fragile, but the sage
Mhm.
is morally robust. That's my point.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree with that. Taleb has this other notion of soul in the game, which is somewhat esoteric, but I think does capture the characteristic of being so invested uh, in a project, whether it's moral perfection or something more specific, that who you are does not change, whatever the circumstances is. Which I think captures more of what a sage would be like.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point.
Yep. Um,
So what about you? What are some of the things you didn't like about the book or thought could be improved?
well, I don't think anything. I wouldn't want to edit this book. I don't. I think it's pretty good. But in terms of I think ideas that Taleb promotes that might be mistaken or on the margin, one could move in the opposite direction. I think there is a sense in which he promotes systems, lives that are closer to the ones you would prefer, closer to the one his personality would prefer, such that not everyone should take his advice or even adopt his moral preferences. So like for example, he rightly points out that having a system that's bureaucratic, say a company that's based around calendars, he'll pick on executives who are in some sense hostage to their calendar. That life is, in a sense, in some senses, more fragile than not. It is less autonomous. But I think Taleb values autonomy, being individualistic, more than other people. And in fact, certain social systems do work well when they have these strict processes and so on, especially larger ones. Now, he rightly pushes against systems being too rigid. Um, but I would say that, in terms of his advice around, removing a calendar, almost having this lifestyle of a aristocratic Mediterranean man who uses their leisure well is ideal in some respects. But there is something to say for people who don't find that, either want more structure in their life, want more interventions, whatever. I think that's one complaint
Yeah.
about Taleb.
I mean, what I was taking what you were saying is like, look, we praise the barbell, or at least praised the barbell earlier for being a kind of a paradigm that you could fit a lot of different lives, a lot of different ways to live a good life that you could put into the barbell thing system, this asymmetrical system. And what you're pointing out is that at some points he seems to be criticizing just a layer lower, just like the kind of content of lives that he wouldn't want to live, like the kind of life where you have to be responsive to your calendar constantly, or the kind of life where your autonomy is limited. And it's like, well, that doesn't really speak to necessarily a problem in having the content not be the one you want to live is not the same thing as having it be a bad kind of life. Just the contrary, there's plenty of kinds of lives that uh, limit autonomy in certain senses that are meaningful, productive, good, offer something more than ones that are predominantly autonomous. That's what I was taking from, and I think that's compelling. I think part of what makes him a great writer is having such a strong personality. But I think maybe the downside of that personality is maybe overestimating how much other people are like him or should be like him.
Right, right. Yeah, he has this idea of touristification, and it's sort of contrasted against the adventurer, or what he calls the flaneur. And he says it consists in converting activities into the equivalent of a script, like those followed by actors. And it, sucks the randomness out of life. You pass up amazing serendipity because you've scheduled some social event in the evening, and so on. You make these kinds of mistakes in your life. But I think there's something to the idea that autonomy is realized when you recognize the limits or the scripts that you're going to adopt in your life in a sort of rational way. And I think that's it's going to be different. People are going to have different personalities, different life plans, different roles, such that the what he calls a tourist may in fact be an appropriate life for many people, even if maybe on the margin, many people should move closer to the adventurer.
Yeah, I like my calendar. Nassim, leave me alone. I'm trying to read a book here. I'm trying to learn things. Don't be coming for me. Um,
All right, what else do you got in terms of bad?
I mean, yeah. It's this is like an exercise, and I have a lot of respect for the thinking. I think one thing about Nassim as a person one of the things that I like about Stoicism is that it's very, very deep. It's something I keep coming back to and I keep learning more from. And to be fair, Nassim is one person versus Stoicism, which is like a school of thought spanning 500 years of popularity. But I've only read one other book by him, which was Skin in the Game. And one of my disappointments about it was that I found it to be a lot of the same ideas, kind of maybe played upon, like themes that were returned to. I didn't find his second book as to be as great of a paradigm shift. And I think about this idea of, the fox versus the hedgehog, which is the idea that, some thinkers have many small, interesting thoughts, and some thinkers have just one big one. And I wonder if Nassim is somebody that has one big one and has spent all of his works, kind of someone who hasn't read them all yet, but a lot of his works kind of ruminating on them, clarifying them. You referred to it earlier in this podcast as like, kind of a way of thinking or like an approach to life. And there's something really distinctive about it. Um, but maybe it's not the kind of thing that shifts or changes. That's not a criticism of the book, but maybe something that, I wish the other one was as good as this one. And I think it's maybe I had a sense after I read Skin in the Game, like, oh, the first book is maybe this real inspirational moment, and then the next one is okay. Well, we're kind of back where we were, just talking about them in a different way.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's something to the idea that he has had a few key ideas in his life and then applies those to different domains. There is something to that.
Yeah.
Um, I like Skin in the Game. I think the book Fooled by Randomness, his first uh, popular book, I suppose, is very good. Um, but they do have declining marginal utility. That's certainly true. I should also say I like the Bed of Procrustes. I think that's also a list of aphorisms that is also fun to leaf through. He's not a hedgehog in the sense that someone who's a Marxist or a conservative has this rigid framework and applies it to different problems. Not a hedgehog in that sense, uh, but he certainly does have. And when you're reading his works, does have a few core ideas that then he's applying to different fields. What makes this seem less like a hedgehog, I think, is that many of his thinking is what he calls heuristic based or rules of thumb based, which means there is, I think, if you try to pull it together, like the way a systematic philosopher would, whether it's Chrysippus or Leibniz or Kant, he's not a thinker like that who has a full, thought out, precise system, which is both, I think, a pro and a con. And if we move to some of the some provocative questions that I'm left with, there is a sense in which his work is a critique of the early Greek Stoics who were more systematic, and an argument for someone like Seneca, who, yes, Seneca has a system in the background. He is a Stoic, but he doesn't spend as much time on some of these more, I think of theoretical matters as some of these other philosophers. He is more, one gets a sense that he is more practical. He has this rhetorical flair that sometimes seems like he's just letting his talent run and saying things that aren't even that stoic, but are witty or something like this. Uh,
Yeah.
um, and I think that's a sort of an open question: is do you in fact need that precision of the early Greek Stoa, or is something like Seneca that's grounded in this framework but less tight, or even Marcus Aurelius for that matter? Is that enough, or perhaps even better, not as fragile? It doesn't depend on a specific view of logic, physics, what have you.
I mean, I love that. I never thought of that before. That's really interesting. Because one of the things that Stoicism is proud about, at least the early Stoa, is this idea of, well, we've got a system, and then our system. There's this often famous quoted line about how, if you can prove one part of our system false, the whole thing falls down. That's how interlocked our system is. And maybe you look at that before Nassim and you say, well, that's really robust, it's really strong, it's really secure. And Nassim actually looks at that, maybe it says it's fragile, because it's the kind of thing where if you knock down one piece, the whole thing falls apart. As opposed to maybe Seneca's not following a perfect system. Seneca's sometimes a hypocrite, sometimes goes wavers on some stoic ideas, but there's a kind of there's then an anti-fragility to that way of living. I think about people with their diets. If you have this really hardcore diet and you break it and you go, well, what's the point? So your attempt to make this kind of secure, robust diet has actually lended itself to fragility, instead of, oh, well, this is a bad day. I'll make it up with some good days. I'll have some fluidity to it. I've never thought about that between the Roman Stoics and the early Stoics, that kind of rejection of the framework before. Um, which again, I think comes down to this focus on skin in the game, practice, and the Roman Stoics on like practicing it and reflecting on students who are practicing it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that also comes down to this thought on it's related to it's really an epistemic approach that's more pragmatic and practical, where a theorist is focused perhaps on in epistemology the true and the false always, but that's potentially fragile, right? You're just gonna as if you have an entire system that's built up, that's sort of serially built up on its foundations. Well, when a given, if it depends on so many assumptions, one assumption being false breaks the whole thing. But if you're instead of trying to always aim for the true, avoid the false, you have some dichotomy like sucker versus non-sucker is what he says, or you could think of it as maybe winning or losing in whatever domain that that's not as fragile to have. It's not the sort of thing that's going to be upset if you just have a single assumption. You're not focused on winning arguments. You're focused on winning as such, and
Yeah.
you're okay to have the perfect picture. You just need to have one that's good enough to make good decisions
I
and
mean,
not be taken in by terrible mistakes and so on.
it makes me think of Kant with that famous line of Kant, where it's like, it's immoral to lie. And like, yeah, well, if a serial killer came to your door and asked you where your family was because he was going to kill them, would you tell the truth? And Kant's like, yes, yes, I would tell the truth. And it's like, well, in terms of like the liar, non-liar distinction or the truth and the falsity, you don't really know how to explain it through that. But sucker, non-sucker, well, Kant's being a bit of a sucker there. If he tells the serial killer where, the people he's trying to kill are. So there's that kind of fluidity that comes in that concept, right?
Right, right. Yeah, yeah.
One thing,
What else do you have in terms of provocative?
yeah, and one thing that I really liked about this book, we've already talked about anti-fragility being a kind of virtue ethics, but Nassim does what Plato does, which is he extends virtue beyond the individual. So there's virtuous government, there's virtuous business, If you think of that as being kind of anti-fragile, right? So we look at, well, what is a good business like? What is a good government like? What is good policy making like? And then we can apply that to the individual. Well, it has this idea of anti-fragility. It has this idea of the people making decisions having skin in the game. It can have minimization of exposure to downside with maximum exposure to upside. These are all the things we could say about good businesses, good government, and then we can apply those to the individual and we can kind of go back and forth. So, I mean, you referred to it earlier as being fractal, but this fluidity of movement between what we can learn at the macro, we can apply to the micro. And that's exactly what Plato does in his Republic. But I've never seen someone do it so compellingly before or not before, but since Plato, really, in the modern era, these making these lessons, I guess, pulling these lessons out to a level that really does cross apply. So yeah,
Hmm.
kind of. I mean, it's undertaking Plato's project a little bit there in a way that I think is cool.
Yeah, I really appreciate this aspect of his thought as well. Um, and it's interesting to see it play out in business and politics for Taleb in particular. He has this focus on starting businesses, ensuring that you have that skin in the game, very specific investment views on how to invest well, um, and then also a collection of political ideas that don't map obviously onto some of the existing ideologies, but you can see how they flow through this very same principles or heuristics he uses to come to his conclusions in investing and business.
Mhm.
I think there can be a kind of there is always that risk that you're being too much like a hedgehog, as it were, when you do that. But I think there's also an advantage to thinking in a consistent manner like that. And if you can judge, the thinking by its fruits, I think he does relatively well when compared to other, so-called public intellectuals or public philosopher types.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, agreed there. Um, I think he does do well compared to other public intellectuals. I think that's something I think he stands by. Um, at least in that public persona, it can be abrasive, but it seems almost, I don't know, principled in a way, or internally consistent, maybe.
Hmm. Yeah, he does have this provocative, this another idea, which is as a part of his ethic, which is something like if I say something after, 3 glasses of wine, then I should say it in person in writing. Otherwise, I'm not. It's cowardly to not do that. It's not either not authentic, or just uh, lame. Which I think is an. I'm not sure if that's true, but is at least worth thinking
Yeah.
through, and perhaps uh, if there is that thought, if you wouldn't say something in public, then you shouldn't say it in private, and maybe more people should move in that direction, but some others should go in the opposite direction as well.
I mean, that's something that I struggle with, like being, I guess, provocative, but maybe a bit of inspiration there. One other thing that I wanted to point out, I mean, this kind of connects to the previous point about being provocative, saying what you think. In Stoicism, there's this idea of both theory and practice are necessary, and but often there's this idea of first you learn the theory, then you practice, and I think the scene inverts this. Um, this idea, if you want a philosopher king, better to start with a king than a philosopher. Is something that he says, and which I think is a great line. And so it's this idea of first practice, first do, then you kind of codify and you solidify by thinking about what you've done, thinking about what you've learned through doing. And so he has these ideas about, academics are often, or ethicists really, let's say if we keep it to the ethical part, they're people that just write about other people who have done. Um, Good behavior isn't generated by the ethicist. The good behavior of the excellent person is then recorded and codified by the ethicist. Um, and so there needs to be this idea of practice, action as the number one. Theory is then the codification, or I guess maybe the exploration once you have done. And I also thought, just going back to that line, I never thought before about the philosopher king as being symbolic of the perfection of theory and practice. I always thought about the philosopher king as being this idea of an instrumental benefit, right? We want the kings to be philosophers because we want them to be good kings. But I never took a step back and thought, well, the philosopher king is that person who's figured out when is the time to quote, when is the time to do theory, and when is the time to do practice. And that's a maybe a different way of framing Marcus Aurelius that I think is it gives me something to think about.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. And I think something to aspire towards, and again, another place where the fractal nature of the thought appears, both in Taleb, but maybe even more deeply in Plato. Right, right. Another line: the only modern dictum I follow is one by George Santayana. A man is morally free when he judges the world and judges other men with uncompromising sincerity. All right, we can end it there. Don't need to keep on
Awesome.
reading Taleb lines. All right, thanks for listening, all. Hope you found this useful. And yeah, maybe we'll cover another book of his, or if there's some other thinker we should dive into, let us know.
Awesome. Thanks, Gil.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.